My name is Christian Hudak, and I am the executive director of the Dunhuang Foundation. Usually, our webinars are hosted by Rachel Parikh, but unfortunately, she had a conflict, so I am making a cameo for this time only. I'm joining you from Australia, which is why it looks like summer in my background, so that might be a little disorienting, especially in the middle of such cold in the United States. But wherever you're joining us from, thank you so much. Um, Tonight is our fourth lecture of our Curating the Silk Roads lecture series, which features 7 esteemed curators from U.S. museums that share their expertise and perspectives on Silk Road studies. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Jacqueline Chow. Dr. Jacqueline Chow is the Cecil and Ida Green Curator of Asian Art at the Dallas Museum of Art. She joined the DMA in 2022 from the Crow Museum of Asian Art, where she served as Senior Curator of Asian Art since 2016. A specialist in East Asian and Buddhist art, she is a widely published author and frequent lecturer on Asian art. She previously worked at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she taught courses in Asian art history and contributed research to the Chinese painting collection at the Art Institute. She holds an MA and PhD in the history and theory of art from Arizona State University and an honors BA in art history from the University of Toronto. At the DMA, she most recently curated Love Island, Japanese weddings of the Edo period, and completed the reinstallation of the museum's China and Japan galleries. So without further ado, Dr. Chow, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight.
Thank you very much, Chris. So just before I begin, I wish to thank the Dunhuang Foundation for this invitation to present today. I am especially grateful to Mimi Gates and to the board of the Dunhuang Foundation and also to Dunhuang Academy for the incredible opportunity to visit Dunhuang and the Mogao and Yuling Caves sites last year. So I was able to see many of these paintings in person, which was nothing short of inspirational and continues to fuel my work here at the museum. So, my title for today's talk is called Envisioning Dragons and Dragon Kings. The Chinese dragon, or long, is a unique composite creature in Chinese art and culture, a symbol strongly associated with supernatural transformation, political authority, and divine will. Traditionally linked with water, rainfall, clouds, and thunder since Neolithic times, early folkloric, Buddhist, Daoist, and Confucian associations with the dragon further contributed to the development of the creature's auspicious interpretation and visualization. So today I thought I would begin my talk with a discussion of the various roles of the Chinese dragon in Chinese art and culture and also its early aesthetic development. I will then focus on the visual development of the Dragon King. In early Chinese Buddhist art and mythology, the dragon serves as one of the 8 protectors of the Dharma, and we find that the Sanskrit terms for Naga and Nagaraja, serpent-like creatures in early Indian art and mythology that play prominent roles in early Indian Buddhist texts, were translated as in Chinese as Chinese dragons or Long and dragon kings, Longwang. So, featuring examples from museum collections and also from the Dunhuang Cave Shrines, this talk will illuminate the unique role and representation of the Chinese dragon and dragon king in Chinese art, as well as explore the transformation of its image. So, unlike other scaly insects or other sort of real world animals, the Chinese dragon is this supernatural beast that has been imagined, mythologized, and divinized, a symbol that's strongly associated with imperial power as well as supernatural transformation. And so, as such, from ancient times until now, the dragon's representation has remained popular and undergone many developments in terms of its visual form. Dragons and dragon-like creatures play prominent roles in Chinese folklore and mythology and are perhaps the most common mythical animals mentioned in ancient texts. Dragons appear in the mythological Huangdi, or Yellow Emperor's reign, who flourished from the 26th century BCE. And he is included among the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, which are a group of mythological rulers or god kings in ancient China who use their abilities to help create mankind and impart essential skills and knowledge. So the 3 sovereigns are generally referred to as Wuxi, Nuwa, and Shenong. So Fuxi was the mythical creator of fishing and trapping, Nuwa was the mythical creator of humans, and Shennong was the mythical creator of agriculture. Fuxi was responsible for having devised a record-keeping system of knotted cords and was famously known for having created the 8 trigrams, or bagua, as you see on the screen, which were and are still used for divinatory purposes as described in the Book of Changes, or the I Ching. And those contents date back as far back as the 10th century BCE. So, in creating the Bagua, Fuxi tried to bring all things in heaven and earth into a simple system of notation by developing 8 combinations of trigrams to represent heaven, earth, thunder, wind, fire, mountains, and rivers, respectively. And possibly one of the earliest written descriptions of dragons appears in this early divination text in describing the lines of the hexagram. Um, Qian, or heaven, where the appearance of the hexagram was interpreted as following the natural movements of a dragon. So, according to legend, the mythical emperor Fuxi, while reading the He Tu, which is, or sometimes referred to as translated as the Yellow River chart, on the back of a mythical dragon horse, or longma, which is believed to be a fabled winged horse with dragon scales that emerged out of the Luo River. He used this chart to draw out the arrangement of the 8 trigrams. And so, as the story goes, the water sent forth a dragon horse, and on its back there was curly hair, like a map of starry dots. And then the water sent forth a divine tortoise, and on its back there were veins, riven veins, like writing of character pictures. I paired this diagram with this later, much later 13th century painting by Mao Yuan of Fuxi because it is meant to represent this emperor, but also that there is a reference to the 8 trigrams you can see just on the bottom of the image, and then also the tortoise, him looking at the tortoise. So it's meant to allude to this legendary story. So, as an imaginary creature, the Chinese dragon's early appearance lacked specificity in representation. So in the late Shang Dynasty and Western Zhou dynasties, we find small nephrite pendants with metamorphosizing dragon motifs. So notably, there's a where we see a dragon's tail ends in a bird's head, or where we see a fowl that turns into a fish, or a fish, or turns into a dragon or a human, or vice versa. And so this again further emphasizes the dragon's very early flexible morphology. So here we can see an example from Harvard Art Museum of such a jade pendant, which depicts multiple creatures with the head of a dragon and a large bird as its tail, clutching a curled worm or snake. So written descriptions were even more vague. In the early second century Chinese, there's an early second century Chinese dictionary, 说文解字. The dragon is described as, quote, the chief of all scaled reptiles. It is sometimes dark, it is sometimes bright, it is sometimes small, it is sometimes big, sometimes short, sometimes long. It ascends to the heaven at the spring equinox and dives into the water at the autumn equinox, end quote. So, thus, the physical form of the dragon varied widely and could not be identified as being a specific animal of the real world. Therefore, the term dragon was applied very flexibly and to a variety of animal motifs. So, the specific visual appearance of dragons was first described in text. Of course, it was mentioned in the I Ching, as I mentioned, but when we're talking about an actual more in-depth visual description, that did not actually really happen until the Han Dynasty by Wang Fu, and he essentially standardized the physical features of a Chinese dragon, referred to as the 3 joints and the 9 resemblances. So you can see what he says here. The people paint the dragon's shape with a horse's head and a snake's tail. Further, there are expressions as 3 joints and 9 resemblances of the dragon. So, to wit, from head to shoulder, from shoulder to breast, from breast to tail. These are the joints. As to the nine resemblances, they are the following. His horns resemble those of a stag, his head that of a camel, his eyes those of a demon, his neck that of a snake, his belly that of a clam, his scales those of a carp, his claws those of an eagle, his soles those of a tiger, his ears those of a cow, and upon his head he has a thing like a broad eminence or a big bump called a chimu. So if a dragon has no chimu, he cannot ascend to the sky. So dragons that differed in appearance from the three joints and nine resemblances were later further categorized in the Tang Dynasty into quasi-dragons. So, and these categories also varied widely. Dragons with wings, dragons without horns, dragons before ascending to the sky, flying snake dragons, fish dragons, fire dragons, so and so on. Buddhist, Daoist, and Confucian associations with the Chinese dragon have further contributed to the dragon's auspicious interpretation and visualization. So in Taoism, of course, we see the dragon as the vehicle of the immortals. And in Confucianism, we find the dragon equated with that of the ideal gentleman. The Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi described the heavenly land of the immortals, and with the dragon considered the symbol of the yang force of the and of the Tao, serving as sort of the vehicle of the gods. This concept of immortality or ascendance in relation to riding dragons was visually portrayed early on. Here we see perhaps one of the earliest surviving examples of a painted dragon on a silk funerary banner that was excavated from a tomb in Changsha in Hunan that was dated to the late Zhou period. The banner portrays a male figure dressed in official robes riding a dragon. And to the viewer's left-hand corner is the painting of a fish, if you can see that on the image screen here. And you can see that the dragon is possibly flying above the water. So as a funerary banner, this image is possibly of the deceased soul's journey into the afterlife, and possibly a painted portrait of the deceased. And of course, here we see later painted examples of immortals riding dragons as found at the Mogao cave mural from the early Tang Dynasty. And also you can see a painted version with ink on silk hanging scroll from the Song Dynasty by Ma Yuan, which is a painted portrayal of an immortal riding a dragon. And so in these paintings, this immortal is shown flying through the air on the back of a dragon amongst a background of clouds. And from a Taoist perspective, the dragon becomes this symbol of the Tao itself, as well as this rejuvenating yang force, which is it's rising out of the ocean and bringing essentially water to the earth. A variety of early historical sources, ranging from Buddhist, Taoist, folkloric, and mythological texts, have connected the appearance of Chinese dragons with rainfall, where images of the Chinese dragon were incorporated into rain invocation rituals in order to ensure good harvest. So, according to texts from as early as the 2nd century BCE, prayers for rain were dedicated to local cult deities, oftentimes dragons, who were believed to control the weather. Some of these rituals would include that the supplicant would make a clay image or a painting of the rain-producing dragon deity, perhaps or a cloth or paper image on a paper frame or on a bamboo frame. And essentially, prayers would then for rain would then be made directly to the image or painting. So, in addition to that, sometimes a rain dance was performed where the image was carried during a dance. If necessary, the supplicant or perhaps a shaman was also placed naked under the sun in an effort to activate the dragon's sympathy and therefore coerce it to create rain and alleviate the supplicant's bodily suffering. And these are all recorded texts, like early texts of possible practices that were engaged in. There were altars sometimes that were also erected at certain sites where offerings were made of food and alcohol. The size and number and color of these images, sometimes they were made paintings or they were physical images made of clay. They would be arranged specifically. There was very many rules associated with these rituals. And of course, there was a sutra, that was recited. The most important sutra recited and followed in these rain ceremonies was the Mahamegha Sutra, or the Sutra of the Great Cloud Requesting Rain. This was a sutra that was first translated by Gupta in 557 or so, and it was also retranslated again around 589. And so over time, these practices for rain invocation, what we've just described, these practices continue to evolve. In the Tang Dynasty, paintings of dragons and temples dedicated to the worship of dragons were used as tools for prayers for rain. Later, Ming Dynasty emperors also performed prayers for rain in times of drought. And so this tradition of offering imperial sacrifice and prayers for rain continued through to the end of the Qing Dynasty and was fervently practiced. So we can see that this association with rulership was very much in many ways associated with the dragon image and came to be associated with the dragon image. The right to rule in early Chinese civilizations was strongly connected to one's ability to be able to invoke the dragon. And so, from as far back as the Shang Dynasty, Chinese rule and kingly virtue became very linked with the prayers for rain. During the Han Dynasty, the appearance of the dragon became directly associated and connected to the emperor and imperial rule, from tales connecting the dragons to the birth of Liu Bang, who was the founder of the Han Dynasty, or by association, visions or sightings of dragons came to be considered as auspicious omens and perceived as signs of heavenly favor. So the visual representation of dragons persisted from all of these periods from the Yuan dynasty and was widespread in Ming and Qing dynasty court art and decorative arts, coming to symbolize the emperor himself and further developed as an imperial symbol. Ordinary dress for the emperor was commonly referred to as the dragon robe, made of yellow satin and embroidered with dragon patterns, as seen here in these Qing dynasty imperial portraits. From the Song dynasty, the dragon became the symbol of the emperor and by convention to refer to the emperor's person. His body was the dragon body, his hands the claws, his capital the dragon's pool. In addition to the dragon serving as a symbol of imperial rule, the sight of a Chinese dragon continued to bear great protective meaning and was particularly included in all aspects of decorative design. So we note the presence of the coiling dragon motif as a dominant design on ceilings of traditional Chinese architectural interiors and exterior roofs. So for like this temple ceiling here in the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, other dragon-like creatures are representative of not only the dragon itself, but also of believed to be of the dragon's kin. So according to legend, the dragon is said to have 9 sons. The dragon's 9 sons each display typical dragon-like features. However, each of them are distinguished by different attributes, functions, and manifestations. And so sometimes the designs of the 9 sons were often used to decorate eaves, ridges, balustrades, and terrace bases of ancient Chinese buildings, weapons, and vessels. And so throughout the Mogao cave complexes as well, we find many gorgeous early painted and sculpted examples of dragons, such as this medallion on the ceiling in Cave 61 of a dragon chasing a pearl, or here we have an added decoration on the beam of a niche in Cave 248 with serpent scale body, horns, and bulging eyes. And furthermore, we find that there are many temples that were erected dedicated to the worship of dragons that were built throughout history. Susan Nikan's study of temples in Beijing from 1400 to 1900 lists at least 64 different temples dedicated to dragon kings during this period in Beijing alone. So this image is of another famous dragon pool, black dragon pool, where it's believed that there is a dragon that resides in it in Yunnan province that's particularly efficacious. So in Buddhism, we find the presence of dragons, originally Nagas, at the Buddha's birth and the development of the concept of the Buddhist dragon king. But with the early transmission of Buddhism from India to China, the Chinese word for dragons, or long, was used to translate for Naga. And Nagas, as mentioned, are a serpent or cobra-like creature in early Indian mythology. We see that this translation occurred in Chinese Buddhist ritual literature as early as the Han Dynasty. And so we see that there, as a result of a conflation of the Chinese dragon and the Indian Naga in Buddhist texts. A cursory review of a selection of encyclopedias and dictionaries of Buddhist terminology today continue to show the term Naga as being defined as a dragon. In Indian Buddhist cosmology, Nagas and Nagarajas appear in the Pali Canon described as semi-divine serpents who reside with their retinues in luxurious palaces at the bottom of the sea or in rivers and lakes. Visual representations of Nagarajas or Naga kings are frequently found at Indian Buddhist temples as part human and part snake, as seen in this carved example from Ajanta. In early Buddhist stories, Nagas were protectors of the Buddha. So, according to the Lalita Vistara Sutra, a Sanskrit Buddhist sutra dated to sometime in the 3rd century, shortly after the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, achieved enlightenment, he visited Lake Mukalinda, which is a lake that was inhabited by a Nagaraja of the same name. So it's said that the Buddha wandered to various places for meditation. 1 week of meditation is spent beneath the tree of the Nagaraja Mukalinda. While the Buddha was sitting under this tree, wind and rain arose. At this time, the Nagaraja came from his abode and coiled himself around the Buddha 7 times, spreading his hood over the Blessed One's head. Now, visually, we have seen this translated in many pieces. So this is an example in the collection of the British Museum. It's a drum slab relief from a stupa, which is an image, and you can see in the center that there is an image of the Buddha protected by the Naga, this Naga king, this Nagaraja Mukalinda, also surrounded by worshippers as well from the 3rd century. And I just wanted to share also a piece from the Dallas Museum of Art that is dated much later. But I wanted to include a piece from the collection that also is sharing an expression of the same story. This is a later Cambodian expression where the historical Buddha is seated in meditation on the coils of the famous Nagaraja. So Chinese records of travels to India by Chinese Buddhist monks demonstrate how Naga was also translated with dragon. So, in James Leger's translation of the famous Chinese monks Faxian's narrative of his travels to India and Ceylon from 399 to 414 CE, Faxian relates the legend of the Shakyamuni Buddha's birth when describing famous sites around the city of Kapilavastu. So he writes, so 50 lei or east from the city was a garden named Lumbini, where the queen entered the pond and bathed. Having come forth from the pond on the northern bank, and after walking 20 paces, she lifted up her hand, laid hold of a branch of a tree, and with her face to the east gave birth to the heir apparent. When he fell to the ground, he immediately walked 7 paces. 2 dragon kings appeared and washed his body. At the place where they did so there was immediately formed a well, and from it a well as from the above pond where the queen bathed, the monks even now constantly take the water from there and drink it. So in the Chinese translation and recounting of this, famous story, the Naga are equated with the Chinese dragon. And in this case, the dragon kings that are said to have appeared are in fact 2 Naga kings, specifically Nanda and Upananda. And so, in addition to serving as these staunch protectors of the Buddha and the Buddha's relics, Indian Naga, like the Chinese dragon, were also famously understood to have the ability to bestow rain. Thus, the terms were used interchangeably by the language translators. So, with the connection of many pre-Buddhist historical sources that have connected the appearance of Chinese dragons and Nagas with rainfall, we thus have numerous Nagaraja or Dragon King or Longlong tales that emerge and they conflate, in which that it was believed that every water source was reigned over by different dragon kings with various powers, ranks, and abilities. So, as mentioned in the beginning, with its very flexible composite morphology, the Chinese dragon, as an imaginary creature, was historically considered by Chinese artists to be one of the most difficult subjects to paint successfully, simply because one must be able to capture the likeness of a creature that has never been seen with the human eye. So how does one capture the spirit of such a creature and translate that vision effectively to a wide audience? How do we know a dragon when we see one? So in the early Song dynasty, successful dragon paintings were said to have demonstrated Wang Fu's three joints and nine resemblances. But to be skilled at painting dragons was considered a very difficult feat, for one must be able to balance proper brushwork with an imagined creature's transformative and divine spirit. In the Yuan dynasty, there was an art critic named Tang Ho, and he observed in his book and he observed the difficulty of painting dragons in general. He famously writes, one has to distinguish the spirit of horses in viewing horse paintings, and one has to recognize the transformations of dragons in dragon paintings. Therefore, dragon and horse paintings are most difficult. However, if one mainly focuses on the transformations or of the dragon's emergence, the brushwork would become reckless ink play and lack painting discipline. If one was restricted by the painting method, then the idea of transformation is lost. Therefore, painting dragons is especially difficult. So we can see that, while the roles of the Chinese dragon and the Naga at times conflated and functioned similarly, how did artists then reconcile the Chinese idea of a dragon and dragon king with the Indian Buddhist idea of Naga and Nagarajas visually? So the history of dragon painters and painting in China is long and illustrious. The origin of dragon painting is actually regarded to have begun with the mythical Emperor Fuxi's creation of the eight trigrams, which I shared earlier. The famous Tang Dynasty art connoisseur Zhang Yuanyuan, in his very famous record of famous paintings in history, Li Dai Minghua Ji, identifies Cao Buxing as the first master of dragon painting. He was active in the early third century. It's recorded that during a month of drought, that prayers to rain were performed with no result until Cao had a painting of dragons, which was arranged. His painting of dragons was arranged upon the water, resulting in 10 days of heavy rain. Unfortunately, there are no paintings by this artist that exist for us to know how truly efficacious his works are. This is only recorded in text. Of course, we also have another very famous painter who was recognized as also a great dragon painter, which includes Gu Kaizhi. Um, Gu Kaizhi, of course, is well known as a master painter and writer, and he's particularly noted for excelling at painting figures and portraits, and for his ability to capture a person's true likeness. Gould's paintings today are well known in many later copies, through such later copies as Wise and Benevolent Women, which is a painting in the Palace Museum in Beijing. Also, Admonitions of the Court Instructress to the Palace Ladies, which is also there's one in the British Museum. Gould's paintings of individual dragons apparently do not survive. However, we can gather a sense of his very famous finely painted lines from other scrolls attributed to him, such as in this detail from the longhand scroll Nymph of the Law River that's in the collection of the Fur Sackler, most likely dated to the Southern Song period. The scroll illustrates a poem which tells the tale of a love story between the poet and a nymph. And this is an opening scene um, which illustrates sort of this is a later scene actually. The nymph is being shown accompanied by several divine animals seated in a chariot that's drawn by six dragons. And the dragons here are elongated and delineated with very fine, even lines as they begin to soar. And of course, it's very reminiscent of the way Gu is said to have famously portrayed female figures. And so when considering the Song Dynasty copy of the Nymph of the Low River above, we can imagine that the copyist of this original of the copyist who created this piece from the original Gu's original was trying to employ a similarly thin, even line. And perhaps this gives us a sense of what perhaps Gu's original dragon painting style might have looked like. And of course, there is another artist who is also very, very famous, who we do not also have any examples of, which is it's Zhang Shenyou. And he was also very noted as being a very famous painter of dragons. The story is highlighted through a very famous Chinese idiom known as 画龙点睛, or to bring the painted dragon to life by adding vitality to its eyes. That idiom is based off of Zhang, a story of Zhang, this artist. It's said that he once painted four dragons on the walls of a temple, and onlookers were very puzzled when they saw that he had not painted their eyes. And he explained that if he painted their eyes, the dragons would fly away. So people, of course, did not believe him and urged him to paint their eyes. And so when he did add the eyes to the two dragons suddenly broke out of the wall. They flew to the sky, and the sky was filled with thunder and lightning. And the two dragons that did not have their eyes filled in remained on the wall. So that's a story of the power of being a skilled dragon painter. Now, sources that focus specifically on the visual representation of as I mentioned, we have many, many examples of depictions of dragons on their own, but sources that focus specifically on the visual representation of dragon kings and their various transformations within a Buddhist context in the Chinese artistic tradition is actually quite limited, as the dragon king was not a traditional subject category in Chinese painting. So, an example of an early visual depiction specifically of a dragon king is actually found in this painting, which is a long hand scroll of Buddhist images. And the scroll was painted actually sometime between 1173 to 1176 for a ruler of the Dali kingdom, and it measures up to 53 feet long. So it's quite long hand scroll. And the hand scroll begins with an imperial procession followed by numerous Buddhist images that include Chinese dragons, dragon kings, arhats. There's 20 or so Avalokiteshvaras of different types, the six patriarchs of Chan school of Buddhism, as well as depictions of several monks and laymen. So Zhang, the artist, Zhang actually rendered the dragon kings, many dragon kings in the scroll, which is quite interesting because you can see the variation of how the artist approached this. So you can see here Zhang's rendering of the Dragon Kings Upananda and Sagara bear striking resemblance to sort of the existing Indian representations of Nagarajas with their depiction of a hood of cobras, a reflection, and which is more of a reflection of what we had seen earlier. For example, the lovely example from Ajanta, where they're half human, but they have the cobra hood. Um, we can also see that, and just to give a mention back to what I had talked about, you can see the representation of Nanda and Upananda here. And those, as I mentioned before, were the two dragon kings that were the ones who were present at the historical Buddha's birth. So at the same time, I want to share that even in the same scroll, not all of the dragon kings are rendered in the same manner. So you can see here that the artist's depiction of the Dragon King Vasuki is rendered completely in human form, but flanked by dragons and attendants with serpent-like features. So that's how we are able to tell that he is a Dragon King, not so much by him physically exuding dragon-like features, but because of his entourage. And of course, the artist continues to follow aspects of the Indian artistic convention of like hoods, cobra hoods, later in the scroll in his representation of the three-headed cobra hooded female, who Li actually identifies as a dragon princess, the scholars have identified as a dragon princess. And so a wonderful example of dragon kings, also from the Song Dynasty, can be found in Cave 38 at Yulin Grottos. And so here we see a lively group of dragon kings that appear to be emerging from the water as deities with attendants, making offerings to the Buddha that would have been in the center of the room or in a niche to the side originally. So here again, they are portrayed as though human, yet also semi-divine and guardian-like, with features that indicate aspects of their non-human status. A later example after this is a painting by Zhu Yu, who was a very skilled Yuan Dynasty figure painter, painting a representation of the Dragon King. And I've seen this is an album, the detail from an album painting of a scene at the Dragon King's palace. Very little is known about the artist, and few paintings have been attributed to him. But in this painting, we see a regally dressed man with long white hair, and he's shown greeting visitors at a palace gate. The man's royal status is very much indicated by the parasol and the attendants surrounding him to indicate his royalty, his royal status, his noble status. And we can see here also that the Dragon King is portrayed in a completely human form. He's dressed as a Chinese ruler, but the only visual indication of his divine dragon status is the representation of, if you look closely at his two attendants, who appear to be rendered with dragon-like features, and also the fact that his palace is clearly shown to be underwater beneath rolling waves. Chen Hongshou was a famous painter and calligrapher active during the late Ming Dynasty, and he's perhaps best known and admired for his whimsical representation of figures. So in his painted hanging scroll here, the Dragon King revering the Buddha in the rear, hieratic scale is used to portray the Buddha's prominence over the Dragon King. The Dragon King is depicted with a dragon face and a human silhouette. His arms are clasped upward as in a form of respect, fully clothed in a contemporary Ming period dress. When comparing Chen Hongshou's depictions of Dragon Kings to earlier ones, no longer are we reminded of previous Indian representations. The Dragon King here is now depicted with a dragon face, flying whiskers, flaring nostrils, and bulging eyes, in visual contrast to his very conservative regal costume. I wanted to end this discussion by sharing with you all a piece that is considered a masterpiece of Japanese art in the Dallas Museum of Art's collection, which features a Dragon King presenting a jewel to Fujiwara no Hidesato from the Meiji period. So moving beyond China to Korea and Japan, dragons have long existed also in the historical and cultural imagination across East Asia. And in the Nihon Shoki, which is the oldest written official history of Japan, which covers the period of Japan's mythical origins to the 7th century, dragons are mentioned in various ways, but mostly as water gods that were serpent-shaped. Japanese dragons were related to Shinto kami gods who lived in rivers and seas, valleys, and mountains, and who bestowed rain upon their worshippers. This all sounds very familiar, I'm sure. So, given the time period that Nihon Shoki was written, the text itself was originally compiled in classical Chinese, given the close relationship and Japanese interest in Chinese culture and civilization at the time, which you can imagine was also this is the same as as the period of the Tang Dynasty in China. And so the various kinds of dragons and naga that were found in Japan, China, and India, they all have a similar features in common, which is this ability to cause rain and to also reign over these natural water sources. So in this sculpture, the Dragon King is identified by his size in relation to his attendant as being of more senior, more important. We also see that his hat with dragon ornament indicates his true identity in that as that of royalty, as a dragon king. He is depicted as half human and half dragon, and presents in both hands a rock crystal sphere to the samurai warrior he is facing. It's meant to represent the jewel of the tides. And so this sculpture has been recognized as the most significant Meiji period bronze sculpture in America. And we're very, very pleased to have it in our collection here in Dallas. So in summary, this brief overview of Chinese dragons and dragon kings is still only a beginning study, as there are so many more ancient sculptural representations of dragon kings that have not been addressed, nor have we looked at Dragon King altar images, Dragon King temple architecture, as well as looking at the contemporary worship of local Dragon Kings within Chinese cultures today. With the transmission of Buddhist thought from India to China, the appearance and representation of the Chinese dragon and the dragon kings appear to have transformed over time from an Indian artistic tradition of cobra-like representation into that of a more distinctly Chinese style and hybrid of creature and human. So this topic is just one example of how significant Buddhist visual iconography was imagined, interpreted, adopted, and transformed over time as one of many cultural products of Buddhist transmission and exchange. Thank you.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Jackie. We really appreciate, again, you taking the time to do this and to share your knowledge with everyone. We do have a few minutes, maybe about 10 to 15 minutes for some quick questions from everyone.
Mhm,
So if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. There's already about 3 over here that have already been put in. So I'm just going to read those out to you, Jackie, and maybe we can tackle some of these together.
mhm.
Really, actually, you should tackle them. You don't want me talking about dragon. I don't.
I would love your feedback. Yeah.
I'm just going to tell you that they look great. That's pretty.
Thanks. Mhm.
Um, so one of the questions is asking if you would be able to cite the text referencing rituals. It says Mao Cave Immortal Rituals.
Oh, yes. So the scholar that actually wrote a lot about the text and the rituals of the rituals for rain invocation, is that the question?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So the scholar you want to look at is Alvin P. Cohen,
Mhm.
and he did this fantastic study on he compiled a many like early texts all the way from like the second century to like the 14th century or something like that, compiling
Mm.
all of these various early texts, Chinese texts that were discussing
Mhm.
the rain invocation rituals across time. So I do recommend. I can't remember exactly the title of his book, but if you look up his work, he's actually the source I would recommend.
Mm.
Hmm.
And then they also were asking if you would be able to comment on the symbology of the snake, as in Bazi, four pillars snake, related to the dragon.
I forgot to include this last slide. I apologize. The comment on the snake with
Yeah,
the dragon.
yeah.
It's it's interesting because I feel like I'm not sure how much I can say about that. It's just it is interesting because a snake is, in text when they're describing dragons, a snake is part of their physiognomy is related to the dragon, like the
Mm.
scaliness of the body.
Mhm.
And but they still kind of separate the snake from the dragon. The dragon becomes its own separate thing. I'm not sure. I have it's been interesting for me to try and I think that's been part of my interest in this topic was to try and understand and sort of try to understand how to separate when the dragon itself is this composite of all of these animals in so many ways, and how do um I'm not sure how to like I think that's what's fascinating about this
Mm.
topic is the fact that it's like we somehow are able to recognize what the dragon is, but yet the dragon itself is such a composite of so many creatures, and how do you and this exact formula is clearly something that changes constantly.
Mm. There's a number of follow-up questions related to this.
Yeah,
It might be from the same
yeah. It's
person. So would you mind if
Mhm.
maybe I were to share your email address with that individual?
Yes, yeah, that's
Okay,
happy to
great.
try and my best to answer.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
if you're watching, just because it says it's from an anonymous attendee,
Hmm.
which is very mysterious. But if you'd be so kind as just to shoot me an email, or my colleague Rachel Parikh, and that's in your confirmation email for the lecture, you'd be able to just write us right back. I can share Dr.
Hmm.
Chow's information with you. So we're going to move on to another question from my colleague here at the foundation, Mary Louine.
Hmm.
Um, So Mary has a multi-part question, which is indicative of her level of interest. So thank you for your rich contextualization of dragons and dragon kings. At the beginning of your talk, you introduced how Wang Fu established the
Mm-hmm.
standard form of a dragon. His description of the dragon's form includes the feature of a big bump on its head, and
Mm-hmm.
dragons without such a bump cannot ascend to the sky. Is
Mm-hmm.
there any evidence that such a feature influences Buddhist iconography, particularly the Buddha's mark of a cranial mound? Uh, is the cranial protuberance of dragons and of a Buddha's a feature that in both cases signifies their special existences?
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. It's a great question. So, what I find really interesting is that I thought that description was always really interesting to me because I think it's just from that specific time period. And I find that not every artist is actually following the
Mm,
addition of the cranial protuberance. I
mhm,
thought this idea of this cranial protuberance or this churmu is
mhm,
not always seen. It's seen on some like some painters. I noticed that they would follow and include it on some dragon paintings. It's like I've noticed, but it's not always consistent. So I don't know if that could be possibly. I mean, I think about the time period, and maybe there was influence there, perhaps. When looking at, even like Chinese folkloric literature of ideas of cranial protuberances, like not only Buddhist, but maybe Daoist and other kind of folkloric texts is possible. But I haven't actually, I can't say for sure that that's directly connected, but that would be a really interesting topic to
mm,
look into and explore
mm,
further. I just can't say right now, for
mhm.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Hmm.
then the question moves on. As we see in excuse me, I can't speak today.
Hmm.
In the legend of Gu Kaizhi,
Hmm.
you shared, painting in the pupils of accurately depicted dragons transforms
Oh,
them into living creatures.
yeah.
Likewise, painting in the pupils of an icon's eyes is for transformative moment in Buddhist
Yeah.
consecration ceremonies. So
Yes.
how do
Yeah.
representations of dragons and dragon kings relate to those Buddhas, or do they?
It's a great question. I know I do feel like we have so many examples of this
Mm,
kind of thing happening in many, many cultures where the
mm,
second that you are able to paint there in their eyes, the deity or the creature or whoever it is suddenly becomes alive and is
mm,
infused with power. Um, so I don't it's an interesting thing because you know, these stories that I share um are not I don't know if it's necessarily related to Buddhist idea, but I could see that influence
mm.
of this idea of of being able to have this divine connection. Um no, it's a really great question. I'm not sure. Yeah, because you're drawing up a lot of imagery for me right now. I'm thinking about it. Um,
Well,
Yeah, like no, I'm just trying to think about like what's
mm,
a um I know I think it's a great question. I just do not know if that actually was necessary. It's possibly influenced by Buddhists, but I think it could also be influenced by this idea of adding of bringing life to something by adding its eyes to it,
yeah.
not necessarily just dragons.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Which is
Hmm.
super interesting.
Yeah.
Mary, I know you're watching still, so if you'd like
Yeah.
to get in touch with Jackie,
Yeah, I'd love
uh,
to. I'm sorry I'm not able to answer. It's such a these it's really it just it your question is so beautiful in so many ways because it just draws up all this imagery when you think back to, even um, Hindu practices or, where, or, in Tibet or where, where they are able, once the eyes are added, it becomes something else. Yeah.
hmm.
Like in artistic making. Yeah.
Great. And
Yeah.
so I have one final
Hmm.
question here for you from
Yeah.
Li Ling, who asked
Hmm.
Dr. Chow, thank you for this amazing presentation. I'm
Thank you.
also curious if the dragon motif, to your knowledge, has connections to non-Han cultures, maybe to the Xiongnu or steppe or nomadic cultures or tribes.
I actually, that's a great question. I'm afraid I don't know for sure if it already has, if they already existed in the Xiongnu or like the other nomadic tribe cultures or not. I'm afraid I haven't looked into that. But I am curious because I do find what I found so interesting when doing this investigation and this correlation with dragon and naga was that even though the Nagas existed perhaps in the Indian folkloric tradition, but they operated with the same role almost as dragons do. And and it's kind of an interest. And so I am curious if something similar, if not exactly a dragon, maybe perhaps a similar deity of some kind has some similar roles, perhaps in those cultures as well. I just haven't actually, I'm afraid I don't know for sure specifically if there is one that maybe is a pre-existing type of deity that would be able to have has the same functions.
Well,
Yeah.
I I somehow have to find you at fault for not having every single answer.
I
So,
know,
so
I know. I feel everyone, I do apologize. I haven't been able to answer any questions at all very well today. But
no,
it is, but th this is what, so that's what first caught my eye with thinking about this topic was that moment where you realize that, these translations are what set off, I think, a new direction when thinking about, I think suddenly dragons were being put in place where Nagarajas were,
yeah.
and it's just created this whole new storyline of for the same stories, but suddenly there's now dragons that were present at the Buddha's
Mhm.
birth. Like it's just it creates a whole new world of visual culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And,
Yeah.
I, if
Hmm.
nothing else, this has been a talk that clearly has sparked a lot of questions and a number of avenues for further investigation. So, if nothing else, it's achieved that as apart from being super entertaining and lots of beautiful images. So, thank you so much, Jackie, for being here with us. And if there's no further questions, I am going to go ahead and move on just to a little note about our next lecture. So our next lecture is on Thursday, January 30th, and that will be given by Dr. Sarah Larson, the Alan J. Dworsky Curator of Chinese Art at the Harvard Art Museums, and her colleague, Miss Angela Chang, the Assistant Director, Senior Curator of Objects and Sculpture, and Head of the Objects Lab at the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies. Their lecture, Harvard and Dunhuang, 100 Years Later, will look into the collection of Dunhuang artifacts at the Harvard Art Museums, the history of their removal and display, conservation efforts, and their ongoing role at the museums. So I hope all of you will join us. We had a lovely turnout here of well over 100 people, which is great. And I hope that we have all of you and maybe some more come join us for next week's lecture, which is sure to be great. And if any of you are interested in rewatching this lecture or catching it or sending it to a friend, etc., we will be posting this after it is edited. So that should be on our YouTube channel probably within the next week or so. And we will send out a email update to everyone just to let them know that that is available. So once again, thank you, Jackie, for your time. And thank you for everyone in the audience for joining us this evening or whatever time it might be for you. And really enjoy it and have a lovely Lunar New Year and a new Gregorian or new-ish Gregorian year. So yeah, take care and best to all of you. Cheers.